Let us now try to understand what the poem is all about. Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish is a richly complex poem which allows interpretation along several planes. First of all, the poem can be interpreted quite literally on a physical plane. The poem is a graphic narrative of an autobiographical incident. What takes place in the poem is nothing extraordinary. It is something which can very well take place in the life of an angler on any angling day. Probably the incident took place in the life of Elizabeth Bishop when she lived in Florida and was an enthusiastic angler. Thus, the poem is valuable as a detailed and compelling autobiographical narrative. 2. It is possible to interpret The Fish of Elizabeth Bishop as a poem on man-nature conflict. Man, I'm sorry, I've said man. Will I have to face legal action? I'm an old dog. I find it difficult to learn new tricks. Perhaps I should have said man and woman and nature conflict. You must remember that the speaker in the fish is not the first person to catch the fish. We realize that the fish had been caught at least 5 times earlier, and on all those 5 occasions the fish had managed to escape from the clutches of the fisherman or the fisherwoman. So obviously, the subject matter of the poem is not merely one angler catching a fish, but the fish being repeatedly attacked by fishermen. I think we can work out a comparison between the present poem and that great novel, Moby Dick. One of the important thematic strands in Moby Dick is man-nature conflict. And the novel ends with Ahab, that fascinating character, the monomaniacal captain, the ungodly, godlike man. In fact, he's one of my favorite characters in American fiction. Perhaps I'm something of an Ahab myself. Ungodly, godlike man. I'm getting distracted. The novel ends with Ahab being destroyed by Moby Dick. Thus, the novel ends with nature triumphing over man. The same is true of the poem under discussion. In the Elizabeth Bishop poem as well, nature triumphs over man at the end because the angler unconditionally releases the fish back into the water. 3. I think it would be rewarding to subject the fish to an eco-critical reading. An eco-critical interpretation is something much wider than merely studying the man-nature conflict dealt with in a particular piece of literature. In eco-criticism, we adopt a multidisciplinary approach. And I feel that this approach is perfectly suited to the poem under discussion. An eco-critical interpretation of the fish can try to demonstrate the devastating impact of man on the ecology. It should speak of not merely the fish being caught and the fish being released, but also of the oil spread in the water, creating a rainbow, and the oil leaking from the boat of the speaker. There is no doubt that such activities as boating and fishing have generated a devastating impact on the ecology, as demonstrated by the poem. And it would be the task of the student to unearth how the poem demonstrates this by carrying out an eco-critical reading. The fourth interpretation is that this poem is about man-woman relationship. After all, the fish is repeatedly referred to as he in the poem. The fish thus is certainly male. Every woman desires a trophy husband. Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish tells us the story of a woman who tried to acquire a trophy husband, who actually caught him and then discovered that other women had tried the same too. The woman then comes to the conclusion that it would be wiser not to retain her trophy partner, wiser not to marry the tremendous fish. And thus the woman finally releases the tremendous fish back into the water. The fifth reading is that the fish is about a lesbian relationship. In real life, Elizabeth Bishop had several intensely passionate lesbian relationships. One of the most important of these relationships was with the Brazilian architect and landscape designer Lothar de Macedo Soares. This lesbian relationship between Elizabeth Bishop and Lothar de Macedo Soares is the subject of the Brazilian film, is the subject of the 2013 Brazilian film Reaching for the Moon. It would be profitable to bring the fish into conjunction with Reaching for the Moon, because at the end of the fish, the angler loses the fish. And at the end of Reaching for the Moon, Elizabeth Bishop loses Lothar. The final reading of the fish is that it deals with the writing of poetry. The attitude of the woman angler towards the fish in the fish closely reflects the approach of Elizabeth Bishop in real life towards the writing of poetry. Elizabeth Bishop was an extremely talented poet, but she never worked compulsively hard. She never forced herself to write poetry. If poems did not come to her, she was not unduly worried. If a poem came to her, she wrote it. If the first half of a poem came to her and the second half refused to come, well and good. The fish in the poem under discussion stands for the poem. Every poet is aware that he is not or she is not the first person to attempt the writing of poetry. Poetry is as old as Homer in the West and Valmiki in the East. The fish that is caught by the woman angler in the poem under discussion and then released by her symbolizes the poem which came to the poet but which the poet could not complete. Let us take a look at the stylistic component of the poem. The Fish is a rather long poem. It consists of 76 short lines. The poem is organized in a single stanza. In fact, one long, slim stanza. The diction is simple. The words that are used are mostly everyday words. There is a conversational tone in the poem, a personal touch in the poem. This is attained by the repeated use of the word I. The poet says, I caught, I looked, I thought, and thus succeeds in creating an intimate relationship with the reader. The imagery is vivid and detailed. The poet makes effective use of similes like wallpaper, like feathers, like meadows. There is the use of alliteration as well as in tarnished tin foil. Critics have been able to read profound symbolism in the poem. The fish in the poem could stand for nature, could stand for the ecology, could stand for the heterosexual lover, could stand for the lesbian lover, could stand for the poem. The poem, though couched in simple conversational language, is not an easy one. It demands some effort before it allows the reader to bring out its significance.